Hello to all, and welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Marie Arana. I'm the Literary Director at the Library of Congress, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program, the very first program representing a brand new series here at the library. It's called Made at the Library. In this series, you'll learn about some of the extraordinary books that emerge from the Library of Congress collections. For decades, well, really for far more than a century, writers, poets, scholars, artists, and just ordinary people curious about a subject have come to the Library of Congress to research their passions. That personal dive into the collections can result in books or films or musical compositions, folk life projects, visual art, or even works in foreign languages. Whatever your interest, if you're working on a book or creative project, there is probably something you need right here at the library. Our series is meant to show you just how that process works, how books get made at the library, how research gets done, how information gets gathered, and how new understanding can surface from casting a fresh new eye on evidence that has been there all along. In files, stacks, correspondence, and artifacts that reside right here at your National Library. Today, since it's March and since it's Women's History Month, we're going to take a look at a newly published book about that great, iconic First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and how that book was researched and created right here in the halls of the Library of Congress. To better lead us into this program, let's welcome Elizabeth Novara, the American Women's History Specialist in the Library of Congress's Manuscript Division. Liz co-curated our exhibition on women's suffrage last year in 2020. Now she's here to tell us about the collections and how the papers held in the Manuscript Division led to an eye-opening book about this grand American First Lady. So once again, let me say how glad we are that you've joined us for the launch of Made at the Library. Liz, good to have you with us today. Turning this over to you now.
Thank you, Marie, for that introduction. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to the Manuscript Division and to some of our women's history collections, which will be discussed by our speakers. The Manuscript Division is home to more than 70 million items contained in approximately 12,000 separate collections. These collections include some of the greatest manuscript treasures of American history and culture, including Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The division houses 23 presidential papers collections, ranging from George Washington to Calvin Coolidge. There are also papers of members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, government officials, and a diverse array of other personal and organizational records. Among these treasures are many collections and documents that reveal the history of American women. These materials demonstrate women's activism in reform movements, their political acumen, and their scientific, literary, and cultural achievements. The division's earliest chiefs eagerly sought the papers of women who achieved firsts in history, of women who were pioneers in fields formerly restricted to men, and, of course, the papers of first ladies, including the papers of Dolly Madison, Lucretia Garfield, and Edith Wilson. While the Manuscript Division is not home to the papers of Eleanor Roosevelt, there are many collections that document Eleanor's family relationships, friendships, and professional connections. Eleanor's presence in the collections is pervasive. She corresponded with and was observed by many individuals, resulting in letters, notes, and diaries that can be accessed by interested researchers. Our speakers today will discuss some of these collections and the importance of using manuscripts for original research. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Colleen Shogan is a Senior Vice President at the White House Historical Association and Director of the David Rubenstein National Center for White House History. She previously worked in the United States Senate and as a senior executive at the Library of Congress. Colleen also recently served as the Vice Chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. A native of Pittsburgh, she holds a BA in political science from Boston College and a PhD in American politics from Yale University, where she was a National Science Foundation Graduate Fellow. In addition to her position at the White House Historical Association, she teaches American politics at Georgetown in the government department. David Michaelis is the New York Times bestselling author of Schultz and Peanuts and N.C. Wyeth, which won the Ambassador Book Award for biography. His writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, American Heritage, Life, Reader's Digest, American Scholar, and Best American Essays. He lives in New York with his extended family. Jeff Flannery worked at the Library of Congress for 35 years before retiring at the end of 2020. He began his career at the library as a reference librarian in the Manuscript Division in 1985, and then served as the head of the Manuscript Reading Room during the last 14 years. He received an undergraduate degree from Temple University and earned an MA in History from Duquesne University and an MLS from the University of Pittsburgh. And now, please join me in listening to a fascinating conversation about the adventures of researching and writing a book about First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in the first episode of our new series, Made at the Library.
David, the subject of our discussion today is going to focus on the research and writing of your terrific biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. Before we speak about how you researched the book, can you briefly tell us about Eleanor Roosevelt's extraordinary life? She's certainly the most well-known First Lady in American history. Why do you think that is?
Well, she's the longest serving, of course, and Eleanor Roosevelt was an original. She actually recreated this, not even an office, it was more presence when Eleanor Roosevelt came into the White House in 1933. It was a very feminine, retiring, passive presence. Eleanor Roosevelt was like Otis with the elevator. She sent the First Lady up in the air. She flew, she drove her own automobile, she took trains, she took planes. She made the First Lady a mobile force in American life and American politics. I mean, people came to the president, Eleanor Roosevelt came to you. And what she really did was she brought the government into people's lives. She connected the individual. She had a great belief in the individual. She had a great belief in each American and each American's role both in the country, but also that their government belonged to you, that your government was part of your life and that you had a role to play. And in every connection she made day by day by day, I think that was her mission, was to make people understand that democracy is, and as it was for her, a balancing act of institutions, but more it was about the reciprocity between each of us. How do we each treat each other? How do we understand and know each other? How do we allow for our differences? All of those subtleties of democracy, of how Americans live with each other, how we prosper, how we pursue happiness, were all the agendas that Eleanor brought every single day to her life and her role as First Lady. Her own life had spanned the Victorian age to the atomic age, and it's one of the most comprehensive lives, 20th century life, because it covers both the very early progressive years when her uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, and we were talking about the niece of one president and the wife of another. She was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, one of the greatest phenomena in world politics. She and her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, her cousin, her fifth cousin, moved into life in Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Navy of FDR under Wilson. Life before the war, life during the First World War, the great shakeup of the First World War into the 20s, the great revelation of Eleanor Roosevelt that politics could be professionalized by a woman when her husband, with polio, had to reconstruct his life. He had been a candidate for vice president. Now he was reconstructing his life. Eleanor took the banner, ran into politics, directly into New York State politics, and with women now voting, a new force in American life, she was one of the great leaders suddenly in women's politics. On we go to the presidency itself, 4 terms, Second World War, Cold War, atomic age. There's almost no end in Eleanor Roosevelt's life of major 20th century moments and major 20th century movements and events. Not to mention, by the way, people. She knew everybody. She saw everybody, and she went everywhere.
I think readers will be astounded and impressed by the level of detail in your biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. So tell us, how long did you work on the book, and why did you decide to write a book on Eleanor Roosevelt?
Well, I began the book in 2009, and it was published astonishingly in 2020. I say astonishingly because there were times where I wondered if I would get to the end, to the point where we would have a single volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, putting all of that one life. This is why I wrote the book. It struck me powerfully. I had reviewed Blanche Wiesencook's multi-volume biography. It's considered really the standard life of Eleanor Roosevelt. It became a 3-volume biography. I had reviewed the second volume back in the 90s and admired it a great deal. But I always felt that Eleanor was the prisoner, in a way, of the archives, of these of the multi-volume, of the too many facts. We were losing sight of her story. We're much more in biography today, I think, dealing in story and less in magnificent lives. It's more, what is the story that we need to know about this person? I felt it was really important, and partly because there really had not been one since 1959, in a single volume, to tell the story of Eleanor Roosevelt, but basing it on the deep research that I adore to do and that I admire, and kind of history mingled with biography, or biography layered over history, that I am a great admirer of.
So you decide to write a book on Eleanor Roosevelt. So how do you start a project like this? What did you do next?
Panicked. Partly because, well, Eleanor was another reason she was an attractive subject for me, was because actually the access to her papers is such that you too could write a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. Were you that foolish? In that I began to realize the moment I had bitten off this project, bitten off this subject, that it was a great deal more than I could handle in certain ways. I'm very thorough about my research, and when I first went into the FDR library and really got a grasp of just Eleanor Roosevelt's papers at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, there are 1 million documents in cartons awaiting perusal, examination, and transcription, and her handwriting was atrocious. I really love to work in the paper, original letters and papers, where you're seeing and feeling the presence of someone through their handwriting. But Eleanor's handwriting was extremely hard to understand, to recognize. I did get better at it. There were people, wonderful people at the FDR Library, who would help somebody like me when I just could not see what that word was. And there was a wonderful woman there named Virginia Lemonick, who always knew exactly what that word was. And so there was a panic in that here's 1 million documents, but guess what? If you look carefully, all 50 states have repositories, archives, often at universities, where you find more Eleanor Roosevelt papers. Mm-hmm. And the Library of Congress is my touchstone, and I touchstone because I was a 6th grade schoolboy when I first did a report on Holland. We each had to choose a European country, and mine was on Holland. And I remember sitting in the reading room in the Madison building and getting my first, I put in my chit and I got my first book back about Holland, and I was in the big time. That meant I was a professional. I was a Library of Congress veteran, and several of my books before N.C. Wyeth and before Schultz and before Eleanor had started there. We can get back to that, but I felt very strongly the minute I knew that Eleanor was my subject that I was going to be spending a lot of time at the Library of Congress, which is a little terrifying too, because the papers that were available in 20th Century Lives adjacent to Eleanor's were voluminous. So it was at the beginning, it's really a question of what's almost like air traffic control. What are the first flights? Where are you going? What are you going to focus on first? And how are you going to organize this research?
So tell us a little bit about what papers specifically at the Library of Congress you were most interested in. You said that there were a lot of supporting characters in Eleanor's long life. So give us a little bit of an overview of what you were most interested in at the library.
I had a immediate notion that the Alice Roosevelt Longworth papers, the Theodore Roosevelt papers, some of Franklin's papers would be useful. Immediately, and I think it's one of the magic elements of research at the Library of Congress, is surprise, serendipity, and a great deal of luck. And I lucked into a cousin of Eleanor's by marriage. That is to say, her cousin Kermit's wife, Belle Willard Roosevelt. She, the daughter of a foreign minister, a State Department guy whose family owned the Willard Hotel, had married Kermit Roosevelt, Eleanor's first cousin in the Oyster Bay tribe of Roosevelts. And Belle Roosevelt wrote a diary in which every single time Eleanor Roosevelt came to Washington, or she, Belle, came to Washington when Eleanor was in the White House, they would meet for tea or lunch, and they shared secrets. They shared family secrets. And Belle dutifully wrote down, and quite sometimes delightedly and sometimes quite sorrowfully, wrote down accounts of what Eleanor had just told her. And there were certain accounts there on a granular level that made such a difference to understanding why and how Eleanor saw things the way she did. So that's just one. The other one that immediately popped out was that Eleanor Roosevelt was covered, unlike most first ladies, and because the news she was making, and because she had consciously decided that she would have women reporters gather in her office, in the East Wing, in the White House, that is to say, in the office of the First Lady, each week for a press conference. The women reporters had never been afforded such a role in White House press affairs. It was an all-male world. It was an all-male press corps gathering around the president's desk. Eleanor made sure that she made news, and she gave the news to women reporters once a week, and this created a new culture of female reporting, and several of them, Bess Furman was one, but Ruby Black, an AP reporter from Puerto Rico originally, who wrote the first biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, and so Eleanor really was her subject, and she and Ruby became friends. Eleanor was careful to keep distance, and the reporters always actually were almost protective of her. Eleanor was quite bold and frank and candid in her opinions, and what she would tell reporters, they would often say, "Are you sure, Mrs. Roosevelt, that you can stand by that," and so forth. They would check with her, but she developed very, very sympathetic and caring relationships with these women. Ruby Black's papers in the Library of Congress were replete with notes and daily observations. Her daily filings of her AP stories, you could see the differences between what landed in her AP leads the next day in the paper from how she had filed. There were often little details that would be removed. It was a remarkable resource. Bess Furman, another reporter, same thing. Enormous resource of a reporter in action, seeing the First Lady, getting to know her. Rosamond Pinchot, the daughter of the governor of Pennsylvania, known as the Society Girl turned Broadway actress. She, like Eleanor, came from a family of privilege and of politics, Republican family. Also, she made the leap to the Democratic Party as FDR came into power. She was this extraordinary sort of young, blonde Fitzgerald but jazz baby who was knocking Broadway audiences flat, and she and Eleanor developed a relationship when Eleanor began to get to know her and lured her into politics and to work for the Roosevelt campaign. She also had a great deal of, she had issues, and one of her issues that you saw in her diary was that she was a woman who had body image. She was gorgeous, but she had body image issues. She had issues about all kinds of things that Eleanor was immediately somebody who she found as a sort of took as a mentor, an aunt, an older woman she began sharing with, and she began making observations about Eleanor in Eleanor's advice to her. With that relationship, there was a point where Rosamond Pinchot's handsome, philandering husband was gone again, and Eleanor sort of stepped in and gave her advice on how to deal with this and what to do out of her own experience with FDR. And so extraordinary levels of intimacy, personal, professional details from people who were living their lives in Eleanor's life. And you don't find that. Even in, I mean, when you're dealing in a collection like the Million Documents of Eleanor Roosevelt, you're seeing Eleanor's daily correspondence. You're seeing how she viewed the world. You're seeing her diary. All these were heavily mined sources by previous biographers. The Library of Congress was suddenly, for me, a treasure trove of sources unconsulted, and that was the main thing. Is you're under some pressure in terms of publishing a biography, a popular but historical biography of a figure. To what's new is always the question. What's new about your book? Why should we care about Eleanor? And you can make a persuasive case about her life and why it's important again or why it's important now, and that's quite true. But you also have to find ways of looking at her and seeing her life differently.
Terrific. Thank you for those answers. Now I'd like to welcome Jeff Flannery to the conversation, who served as the head of the Manuscript Division's Reader and Reference Services at the Library of Congress. Over the years, Jeff has worked with many famous historians and authors, including David McCullough, Scott Berg, Evan Thomas, Candace Millard, Flora Frazier, Ron Chernow, and of course, David Michaelis. Jeff, in your position, tell us, how did you approach a researcher like David, who makes contact with you and says he's working on an ambitious project like writing a comprehensive one-volume biography of the most famous First Lady in American history? How did you proceed to help with the library's collections? Is there an entrance interview of sorts?
Well, yes, Colleen, actually there is. When researchers first approach the division, we have what they would call in library school the reference interview. And that's where we are able to draw out from the researcher what their interests are. I think when someone like David comes to us with such an ambitious project, the first tendency is to throw everything at them at the kitchen sink, as David may have mentioned. The library has extraordinary collections in all facets of 20th century American history and before, but with someone like Eleanor Roosevelt, who just permeates the collections, as David had mentioned earlier, she knows everybody. She did things. The archivist may first say, "Hey, look, we have like these 60 collections that mention her, and we may have everything else." And while the researcher or the author is very appreciative of that, it can be overwhelming. And I think what really has to occur is a conversation to say, well, are you focused perhaps on a particular period of life or an aspect of that person's career, and how can we help with that? So I think that's very important to begin with, to draw out the person, the researcher, because a lot of times in the course of that conversation, a light bulb will go off and something will happen, and you can say, hey, maybe you might want to pay a little more attention to this collection as opposed to another.
So both Jeff and David, tell us, how much of this is a team effort? David, as an author, how much do you rely on expertise like Jeff's to help navigate the collections? And Jeff, how much did you rely upon your colleagues at the Library of Congress to help David?
Well, first of all, Jeffrey plays a role, or I found myself looking over a couple of emails Jeffrey and I had exchanged, and I was calling the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress, just jokingly, the Grand Canyon of procrastination. Because, there you are, you're in Washington, you're at the Library of Congress. It's pretty magnificent. You feel like you're part of history just walking in the doors there of the Jefferson Building. You pass the statue of Madison. Up on the second floor is a large globe that for me was always extremely actually touching and emotional, because when I was a schoolboy in Washington, discovered actually even in the collections there that Eleanor Roosevelt had met with the head of that school to create an international curriculum. And I remembered as a school child going in the front door of my school, and there was a big, huge globe of the world, and it kind of emphasized that you were a global citizen. It was a theme of Eleanor's that she had brought to the head of this school. And so anyway, seeing that on the second floor, all these places at the library make you feel you are part of American history unfolding almost. And Jeffrey, forgive the metaphor, but he plays the role that there's always on a cop show a kind of, crazy cop who figured out the solution to the crime and is going off on all kinds of tangents. And then there's the older guy who has been around. He's seen it all. He knows what's going on, and he slows, our young ace down pretty fast and says, you know what, you're going off the deep end with this. With Eleanor Roosevelt and with my previous subjects, all three biographies I researched at the library, to my great fortune, Jeffrey Flannery has been there through all three. The continuity is important. When you begin to see a familiar face in this business, it's a pretty lonely business in one sense. You are on your own, and you see a face like Jeffrey's, and Jeffrey would always say to me things like, you've been at this for you've been on this collection for about a week and a half. You might want to think about moving on a little. And that is really helpful. You can get lost. It's a time machine.
Yeah.
You go into these things, and they are not just rabbit holes. You get lost in this world. And you think also, I'm making these extraordinary discoveries. And you are. But you know what? There's a bigger picture to remember. And really always touched me the way Jeffrey was avuncular and kind and scholarly, but always that cop who said, you are going to lose it. You're going to lose your badge if you don't get on with the show here and get back to reality. And that's what you do have to do. You have to get back. And it's like another metaphor. It's like rapture of the deep, divers who go down there and they lose track of their air supply. You get rapture of the deep in the Library of Congress, and you need a Jeffrey Flannery to tug the rope and say, come on back up to the top, champ. You got some thinking to do up here. And those are crucial collaborations.
And Jeff, did you have to consult with anybody else at the library to help David with his research?
Oh, sure. The libraries, in our division, for instance, the archivists who process the collections, that organize them and produce the finding aids and the catalog records, oftentimes they have a knowledge about a particular collection that's very much more in depth than any of the reference staff. Because they've just gone through 40 boxes and folded them up and put them in and looked at many of the documents in there. So we can draw upon the expertise of these folks that are kind of behind the scenes, and even bring them out to talk to the researcher on occasion, if it helps. And of course, the library is not just the manuscript division. We have newspapers, we have maps, we have photographs and prints, moving images. So we can always help direct a researcher to those parts of the library that will complement the documentary record that we have in the division. And as I guess one of the benefits of aging is when you're in a place for a particular period of time, you get to know your colleagues well, and you know who to go to, who might have some expertise in one area, maybe photographs, or another area, newspapers, and you can put the researcher in touch with them, and that helps complement all the other finding aids and catalogs that we have and so forth.
David and Jeff, maybe tell us about a day. What was the day like that you would spend together at the Library of Congress? I think a lot of our viewers would love to know the day-to-day work that it takes to construct and write and research for a successful book and a well-written book like Eleanor. Did you find surprises every day, new insights every day? How granular was the information you were finding?
Well, one thing I wanted to say about the day in the Library of Congress is I think the team, Jeffrey himself, are aware of time in a way that you do not find in an academic setting, in a library. In academia, if you're in an academic library, you are really lucky if you run into what I call a master archivist. It's usually a man or woman in their late 50s or 60s who are slightly past the point of being competitive with you about this subject, and they will show you deeply into the collection at the university library. But below that level are a lot of very competitive people who do not care whether you succeed or fail. At the Library of Congress, they care. And they really care that you use your time well. And so coming in, even just simple matters of getting your things into a locker and then getting seated and getting your collection, the collection you're working with, back next to your desk, or making sure that, I mean, Jeffrey was always wonderful about this. Okay, so you're going to end that. You're winding down on those cartons. We're going to get that off-site collection. It's going to be here tomorrow morning. A lot of planning goes into staging these boxes, these cartons, these trolleys of papers that you're going through very slowly in a very granular way. And sometimes you can get absolutely, laser focused on a diary, on a single thing, a single object in a big collection, or certainly on the trolley of maybe 12 cartons that you have right at your elbow. And during that period, you're discovering that from Henry Brandon, that in November of 1962, the Kennedy White House had a very surprising reaction to Eleanor Roosevelt, to the announcement of Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral. And so suddenly you're lost in that. And then suddenly down the aisle comes Jeffrey, who says, you did ask for those McGranary papers, and the McGranary papers are one of the few collections that you've asked about that need a special request. You might want to remember, you got to put that in, and then that's off-site. We're going to plan for that. How long are you here? Oh, your dad's sick, you're going to stay. It's very personal. It's a very, and Jeffrey and his team are, I just can't say it enough, an extremely caring and actually very committed group of people to what you're doing and what they're doing, and they're doing their work, and they're going about, you feel like you're in a working office of the United States government, where you happen to be an extremely valued visitor from the, from the sticks. And you've come to the center of American life, and here are the records. It's an incredibly exciting experience. There's something of representative government about it. You feel like you have a place here, and that you're part of a larger world. You don't feel that in academic libraries. You feel mostly unwelcome if you're coming from outside the institution, and no one cares, and they don't care if you can put your chit in and wait all day. So far as I'm exaggerating to make a point. They really do care at the Library of Congress.
Jeff, David makes a great point about the ethos of working at the library. Do you care to comment on that?
Well, thank you for your kind words, but I think David did hit on it, that the staff do care, that there's just the perfect kind of I hate the synergy. I mean, that we're not overwhelmed by hundreds of researchers a day, but come in. It's a level that we can work with people and that we can provide service for. And I think the staff really like working at the library. We're not a mausoleum. We want to make the materials available. We love to see them put to good use in these biographies and these histories. We want to, these are treasures, and we want to share them. And I think the staff, that's how they start. That's their operating basis. And we do everything we can to help the researchers achieve that. And I just want to say one other thing about the work is that a lot of times the researcher, the author that comes in, they know so much more about the individual or the subject that they're working on than the reference staff do. I mean, we're generalists in a lot of ways. David knows everything about Eleanor from the day she was born and before until for her whole life. Mm-hmm. And it's that interaction with the staff who we kind of know the collections and how they might interact, but how that conversation with the researcher, that's what I think is a service that we can provide, that we can put them together with it, but we also learn too. And we use that the next time when the next researcher comes in and the next generation comes on. And there's a lot of the staff have been at the library for a long time, and they just acquire that knowledge and they pass that on. So I just wanted to finish up on that.
I worked at a few city rooms when I was younger, in magazines and newspapers, and my feeling in the library was that I was in a kind of city room, but a city room of history. And there were times where you literally find something in a document, in a letter, in a diary, and I would be able to sort of rush up and, Jeffrey Flannery sitting up there kind of like, the editor, but in his office with the glass, the sort of Ben Bradley office. And, I got something here, Jeffrey, you got to see this. And he would be genuinely interested because I'm informing him about something that's in the collection, or I'm just incredibly excited about this. And again, you're not going to find that everywhere. People who are genuinely interested, and that is where the synergy is taking place. And also, it's really important every book could go on for research for every book could go on forever. It really is a Grand Canyon of procrastination. And it's somebody like Jeffrey who will really say to you a bit sharply, so when is this book due? And what are you finding? I mean, is this really, are you really in something that's important right now? Because there are a lot of others, and it's a great reminder. It's great to know that someone is thinking that way, because you do lose track in there.
So you talked a lot about making discoveries in the collections and the manuscripts that you examined. Was there ever a time when you were looking for a piece of information and you weren't able to find it? And if so, how did you handle that situation?
That's a tough one, because I actually try not to look for specific things, because you often won't find them. If you really have, it's sort of drawing to an inside straight in poker. If you're looking for the deuce of clubs, it's pretty unlikely it's going to come up. So often the collections will surprise you with things you never imagined were there, and which become the things that you then track. I can't really offhand think of it. I know that it always is frustrating if you go directly to something and think that's where you're going to find it. It often isn't there. It happens a lot.
There's so much in this book that's noteworthy. Can you both tell us the most important lesson or lessons that you learned from Eleanor Roosevelt in her impressive life? Jeff, from assisting with the research of the book, and David, of course, from the perspective of pulling all this tremendous information together in the one-volume book, Eleanor.
For me, the great lesson of Eleanor Roosevelt was accepting things as they come, accepting life, accepting disappointment, accepting yourself finally, and understanding that to live a life as she wanted people to live it, imaginatively, creatively, with great strength, with great resolve and fortitude, to live it fearlessly, to see and take people for who they really are. I mean, Eleanor is sort of the person you hope you might become if you transcend your fears, if you transcend what life gave you to begin with, and become who you would most like to be. Eleanor really understood that people's lives in a democracy were about treating each other well and about treating each other as reciprocally important human beings. And I always looked at whatever world she was in, whatever she was doing, and every single place she went and every single thing she did was about the person she was with, not about herself. It was about somebody who she was helping, something she was doing, some other person whose life she was improving by every sense she had that she could understand and help that person.
Jeff?
Well, I would say that with Eleanor, it just reinforces to me, from a rather narrow perspective, that even though the great corpus of her papers are at the library in Hyde Park, but that there are other institutions such as the library that can shed great light and on her life and things, and that the extent of the materials that we have is just kind of astounding. Again, David knows it firsthand. When I start to look into it, when assisting him, I just thought, oh my God, here's Eleanor over in this collection. She's in that collection. She's in all these different collections. And I think that's a testament to her life and her career and that incredible energy that she had, that she brought throughout it. And but it just reinforces, again, that especially with these important personages, that the library and the manuscript division just has a lot to offer.
Well, thank you, David and Jeff, for a terrific conversation. And thank you for listening to this discussion about an extraordinary book about a remarkable woman, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Thank you, Colleen, David, and Jeff, for that intriguing conversation. There were so many wonderful collections that were referenced today that it's difficult to select a few to highlight. One point David mentioned was that Eleanor Roosevelt held special press conferences that were only open to women reporters. These press conferences gave women journalists access to exclusive stories of special interest to women and ensured that they could hold on to their jobs during the Depression years. The Manuscript Division has several collections of these women journalists, including Ruby Black, May Craig, and Bess Furman, who were members of what became known as Mrs. Roosevelt's Press Conference Association. In addition, the Manuscript Division recently received the papers of journalist, author, and environmentalist Anne Cottrell Free. Free was the first woman Washington correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune, Newsweek, and the Chicago Sun. She covered wartime Washington with a special emphasis on Eleanor Roosevelt. She cherished her membership card in the Press Association, as well as a letter that Eleanor sent to her in 1947 concerning post-war China, where she was then working as a press special correspondent for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. These items, which came to the library through a very recent donation, demonstrate how the library is actively building the collections so that new discoveries can be made and new perspectives can be gained by original research. If you are interested in learning more about getting started with your own research project in the Manuscript Division, please follow the link to a helpful video about how to access these collections in the Manuscript Reading Room. Again, thank you for joining us today for Made at the Library. We hope you enjoyed the program, and please stay tuned for future episodes in this series.